Thank you for joining. As this meeting, as we all know that we are working on our next roadmap for Guardian. So we have scheduled this presentation just to make sure that you are aware of the worker items, and then we get a feedback from you guys of which is a priority, and we can plan our Guardian roadmap according to that, depending on your use cases, depending on your feedbacks, depending on your priorities given to us, so that none of the high priority worker items which you are expecting from us is missed in our roadmap of Guardian. So just to give you guys a quick update of where we are on our open source Guardian repo. So we have an open source Guardian GitHub repo, and then we have, a lot of community engagement going on. So right now what we are doing is we are having like 2 weekly calls. One is on the vocab standards, where we actually discuss about the vocabulary used in Guardian and how to improve it. And currently we are inviting 103 members of the community. And we also have a technical discussion call weekly, which happens on Wednesday at 8 a.m. this time every week. And there we have 235 members invited, and it's huge and it's very useful for us to get more information from you guys. And, even you can know what is going on in Guardian and what we are working on and what you can expect in our roadmap of Guardian. From the metric side, we have the open source metrics. This is the metrics for March 5th to March 18th. So right now we have 140 total clones, and we have 5,555 total visitors in that particular month, in that particular time span for GitHub repo. So just wanted to give you an overview of what you can expect in our next phase of Guardian. So it will actually focus on enhancing and expanding our capabilities across various aspects to meet the growing demands and expectations of its users, which are you guys. We will also address some of the worker topics, which would be ranging from an overall functionality, security, and also improving the user experience of Guardian. So now I would like to pass it to Onraid, where we will be just giving a quick overview of each of the worker items, because we have 56 worker items, which we wanted to just cover as soon as possible so that, none of them are missed in this meeting. Over to you, Onraid.
Thank you, Prina. I'll try to spend less than a minute on each one of them. So I'll summarize it in my own words. And obviously, all of these are recorded in tickets. And at the bottom of each of these slides, you could see a ticket link. So please feel free to follow up on any that particularly interest you and provide your feedback I don't know if we'd have time at this meeting, but you can always do that in Slack. We're always very happy to receive feedback from the community. So please, if you've got an opinion or suggestion or anything like that, do that at your convenience in Slack or via email. So the first 3 tickets that I'm going to be talking about today in this list are all to do with, to summarize them, it's making sense of the data as it produced by Guardian, or making sense of Guardian policies. And there are different aspects of that. And this particular ticket talks about the pathway to figure things out if you've got an element, let's say an end result of a process, of a workflow, let's say a token or something like this, and then or a document, and you'd want to figure out everything about it. And mostly I've got some data, some verifiable credentials, a document that captures my metrics, or MRV, for example, or I've got a token and I want to figure out what has happened to it, where it's been used, everything about it, all the relevant information. And that's what we call bottom-up data traceability. And as you understand, data in Guardian can mean many things, but mostly verifiable credentials or VP documents or tokens in hedera, but also messages, various other things associated with that. So, yeah, and the difficulty here, or the idea, and I don't know exactly how far we can go with that, but the hope is that we can trace not only the simple direct references to the document, or let's say a token's has been transferred between accounts, and obviously all that thing is available already by other means, but we would like to be able to trace sort of second order effects. So let's imagine there's a data is in verifiable credential document that's been used as input into a formula which calculated some other metric on the basis of which a particular token's been issued. So there's a data transformation happened on this piece of data that then resulted in some action or further transformations. And we would like to be able to trace this. So you then be able to see, okay, this is the piece of data, this data has been produced by this metric, and it resulted downstream on somebody sold something a year later, and it's based through various transformation on this data. So this is the ticket, the bottom-up data traceability. Next slide, please, Prina. So an alternative approach to solving the same problem, not the same, solving the same problem of making sense of data, is when you're looking at Guardian ecosystem as a whole, and trying to make sense of all the activity that happened there. What does that mean? And it generates, even now, it generates a lot of data. And we've done some effort in this regard in doing our indexer work previously. And there's not only there's data available for you to search and find, but also some analytical elements there, some charts that show various statistical properties of this data. But there's much more that can be done here, and many use cases that can be foreseen based on this data, not financial, but business use cases. And they depend on on data and various data associations between different metrics, maybe, or different data points. And this ticket is there to capture that functionality. And as you know, we've discussed this previously at various community meetings. We reach out. These are important sort of major initiatives that we are going to undertake soon. We need a feedback from the community, and we've received some of the feedback, but I encourage you to please contribute more. And the next slide, please, Prina. Sorry, it's taking longer than 1 minute, but other tickets are maybe slightly simpler than this. But the third initiative in this group is to do with, it's slightly different. It's about data, but outside Guardian ecosystem, methodologies that's been developed by various relevant entities in the industry, and being able to map those methodologies, but specifically maybe mathematical methods of calculating something or evaluating something, map it onto the Guardian elements in the policy. To simplify that, let's imagine there is a formula with some summary of some data, A plus B, I don't know, differential equation on C multiplied by square root of something D, right? Would be great if having that methodology published somewhere with this formula, where, and usually there's a formula and then it says A is this, B is that, C is that. You could take that and map it onto Guardian schemas, where there's a schema for A, schema for B, and so on, and then the schema that records that formula. That way, evaluating maybe the accuracy and the quality of the Guardian policy implementation of a particular methodology is much easier, and a person would not have to be a Guardian specialist to be able to verify this. And I'm envisioning maybe two-way transformation, at least one-way transformation, taking a Guardian set of schemas and generating a mathematical representation maybe of that, so that it's comprehensible by humans. So in this case, it's also about making sense of the data, but that's making sense of the data definitions in the policy. Next slide, please. There's a group of tickets, but they're in a sorted list here. They're all to do with improving usability of Guardian. The specific ticket is targeting accessibility of Guardian software. And one of the reasons why I think it's needed is that, at least from my experience at Oracle, I know maybe 15 years ago, Safra said that Safra is a co-CEO of Oracle, Safra Katz. I think it was said publicly that Oracle doesn't produce any inaccessible software. The reason for that, I think, is that maybe there is an industry. I think there's a regulation in the US. I don't know whether that was the reason. Sorry, it's just an anecdotal thing from my past. But I know there is a regulation in the US that prevents government agencies, for example, buying non-accessible software. It's a test and so on. Us trying to be as close as accessibility guidelines in that document are in one of the first steps that we need to do. We generally make an effort there. If you notice that or not, usually we've got color coding, but we also got a symbol, which is a shape that represents a particular concept in Guardian UI, but not in the major gap here is the policy diff. Where when we display differences between policies, we use only color coding, so that needs to change, and that's what this ticket is about. Next slide, please. So most of the tickets have been requested externally by the community, by you. This specific initiative is about integrating complex mathematical tooling that is used by the practitioners and researchers in the industry to capture or to implement methodologies or their mathematical part, where certain calculations happens and so on. At the moment, Guardian supports basic mathematics, but using MathGS library. It's quite powerful, but it's not statistical. It doesn't have very complex concepts that are common for tools like R and various others. We recognize there is a need to advance this and integrate R into Guardian in some way. Still needs to be a conversation how exactly it's going to be, what is the most useful way of doing that. There are various alternatives. We can embed R as a script inside, or we can reference modules that are published elsewhere where they can be executed, whether it needs to be within Guardian instance itself, or maybe there is an R service and Guardian reaches out. So there are various ways that this might work, but the goal is to enable our libraries, our tooling to work in Guardian policies. Next slide, please. Yes, so this ticket is an enhancement and maybe the very last step that needs to happen in order to make a perfect disaster recovery possible. And by disaster, we mean a complete loss of data for Guardian instance, both from the Guardian instance itself, from the backup, and various other things. The only thing that we assume after this ticket is implemented would assume that exists to be able to completely restore the execution of the Guardian policy, not just data, so it's visible and operatable, but the actual state of the policy, so it can continue from where it's left off. The only thing that would need to be available is the keys. Obviously, that can't be restored unless we use some split key combinations of things, but that is irrelevant for this ticket. Yeah, next slide, please. This initiative have been discussed previously. It hasn't been so far or at previous meetings prioritized highly, but this is to enable the creators of assets using Guardian to benefit from those assets or be compensated for their efforts throughout the life cycle of the assets. So as you can imagine, somebody has produced, I don't know, carbon offset worth certain maybe value, and then these needs they can be packaged, repackaged, resold several times to different at ever increasing prices. Potentially it can become valuable, but what's important is that the original creators of this, I mean the people on the ground who actually implementing these projects, were compensated for that and benefiting from that accordingly. There's a mechanism for that in the blockchain industry. It's royalties on NFTs, and we would like to enable that in Guardian produced tokenized assets in hedera. Next slide, please. Yeah, so that's one of the other tickets to do with the usability enhancements of Guardian. We've made significant progress in the last year building various enhancements and assistance tools for policy creators. This is a further evolution. We've got currently, well, let's say, suggestion mechanisms for blocks, but what would be helpful is to have a wizard-based as well as definition-based, form-based definition for blocks, where a guardian may suggest using wizards with explanations, asking questions, and asking less technical, maybe more business questions, and guide the user through creating a policy that addresses the concerns. So next, please. So this is a response to many community members' experiences with various issues minting or interoperating between Guardian and various external systems like hedera or IPFS. And we've implemented significant enhancement of that in the last release. It's called, I think the ticket was called hedera resilience module. It's already there, but during our work, we've made quite a few steps in that path. We've determined that the only really way to assure or to avoid potential errors is to put some of the functionality that deals with hedera on hedera. In fact, some months ago, we've been discussing this with the community as well, that maybe we should have a strategic effort of moving as many pieces onto hedera platform as possible. And obviously it can't happen as a big bang. It needs to happen in steps, and moving this functionality of minting tokens and retirement operations fully onto hedera blockchain would be aligned with this vision. So not only it will give you the immediate enhancement in reducing the risk of error operations, because it's atomic that way, but also would make it more decentralized than it is currently. So it requires basically two steps. It's first to actually move the minting operation into a smart contract on hedera, but secondly, in particular, there are various changes that need to happen throughout Guardian UI, but in particular in the trust chain concepts that we identified, and that's what we captured in this ticket. Next slide, please. This has been requested and discussed multiple times. This initiative is about creating a way of executing, importing, or enabling certain policies. It might not be called import, but enabling an execution of certain policies in a particular Guardian instance in a way that this policy could not have been modified, that the execution is assured to produce the same results without any across all Guardian instances that it can be executed. Yeah, we probably can't achieve this completely, because in order to do that, this execution of the policy needs to be fully deterministic, and this effort and the same problem has been recognized before, and there's effort in the industry to do that in various others, like in SGX, for example, in Intel. It's a trusted enclave within a CPU where certain things can be executed. So it's a fairly complex topic, but we can make advancements to it and guarantee to a certain degree this. So next slide, please. This is to enable a more easier integration of Guardian into other systems, or extension of Guardian by the community members. We do have depreciation policies for APIs, for policy definition language, and various other things within Guardian, but there are things that are external, they're published APIs, but within Guardian execution environment, it's like microservices architecture with various services in there, with workers, with In fact, now we've got this hedera resilience module that also have workers, it keeps tasks, it checks. So it's fairly complex. So there are APIs within those modules within Guardian. And we know some of the ecosystem members extended that, implemented their own modules for integration or into another system, or maybe slightly changing the workflow of Guardian. We are looking at standardizing those APIs, internal APIs in the Guardian, to make sure these integrations and their upgrade cycles and align with the Guardian upgrade cycles. And it's to do also with the release frequency and so on. But this specifically focuses on the changes within the Guardian code that needs to happen for that. The next slide, please. This is a usability improvement in Guardian, but not for users, but for integrators. Currently, Guardian API is as powerful as replicates all the actions that you can do from the UI and as powerful as the UI of Guardian, but also it is as coarse, fine-grained, I'd say, as the UI in Guardian, meaning if you want to integrate certain pieces, you'd need to implement a UI or some tooling that is comparable complexity to what Guardian UI is. And it may not be the easiest way to approach that integration. In particular, for some of the common tasks, and we know they exist across the ecosystem. We've had enough experience and enough ecosystem participants using Guardian through the API to identify some of those common tasks that everybody relies on, and maybe they can be a higher level, maybe a coarse-grained API where these common tasks grouped together for simplicity. So this ticket is about identifying those and developing that API. Next slide, please. We were talking earlier about block wizards, block definition wizards, and I was saying we've got block suggestion mechanism that kind of addresses the same goal of simplifying policy authors' work. But the suggestion mechanism as it exists currently is not simplistic, but it could be improved. It relies on previous policies that have been created. Its view window is fairly limited to the local policies, for example. It doesn't use any AI, for example, and so on. So it's very precise. It suggests a variant that you accept or not accept. But it could be that other factors are taken into consideration. Maybe, some of the questions asked and answered and so on. So AI is one of the pathways we may want to go here, but maybe it's just generally improving the rules here. So next slide, please. This ticket is related to the previous tickets where we were talking about tamper resistance policy imports. It's not exactly the same, but it also is about creating, but another way of achieving maybe similar thing is creating a distributed policy execution system where each piece in the pathway of data and so on is executed on the Guardian instance or maybe across multiple Guardian instances with a flexibility and assurance that the result is still valid and valuable. And we've got policy chaining currently in Guardian where you can actually do that. But what can't really happen yet is this distributed execution is not as well coordinated as an execution of the same policy workflow in a single Guardian instance. Notifications, like requests, various other aspects of a usability for a user or users of Guardian are not there. This ticket would address this problem. Next slide, please. So this ticket is frequently confused with the other ticket we've discussed about safe points, and they would say DR, and DR meant disaster recovery there, of course, but you also said dry run is called DR. But it's a very different, the purpose of this initiative is very different. This previous initiative was talking about restoring Guardian in the case of disaster recovery. It's a very practical almost like business continuity issue. Here, we're talking about the usability of Guardian policy authoring tools for policy creators, as common in the software development industry. And we've observed that and ourselves experienced creating various policies, that usually what happens, a concept is added to a policy, and then you'd use dry run to check whether that concept works as expected or not, and then maybe modified. And so frequently happens is a certain chunk of work is done on the policy, and then it's executed in a test mode, which is dry run mode. But currently, in order to do that, to execute it in the dry run mode, you'd have to start from the beginning and then input all the data into the policy that would generate the outcome that you're looking for. And it's time consuming. So what we would like to do here is to add a facility to restart that execution from a particular save point. So you've developed something and you're happy with it, you put a save point in there, and next time, you're developing something new, and next time you try to test what you've just developed, you start from that save point immediately, not from the start. It'll just save time and make it much more pleasant experience. Next slide, please. This ticket is about creating, as you know, we've got contract-based retirement operations in place in Guardian already, and they've been designed to be flexible and extendable. So what we would like to do with this is to enable additional rules about retirement to be introduced into those retirement contracts without having code. At the moment, you can create custom retirement contracts and deploy it for your instance of Guardian, and that way you add the rules in there, but it requires software development, obviously, and testing and customizing Guardian, which is not necessarily what you'd want to do. We would like to add facilities for enabling or disabling and parameterizing different additional rules for retirement to make it more appropriate for production business use and various use cases outside the just simple sort of matching and retirement use case. Next slide, please. There's been a number of cases where there were bugs basically in Guardian, where certain terms in the UI has been misspelled and so on. So that's where it's not the reason why we want to develop this, but it was something that triggered this conversation. But in reality, a best practice to develop software products like this is to have a sort of centralized vocabulary of terminology. And there's a group that works on the vocabulary for the data that Guardian produces. It's called Vocab Group, and there are various initiatives within that group that's been discussed and being worked on as we speak. This is slightly different. This is to do with the vocabulary in Guardian UI, not only its correctness, just in terms of languages, but also in terms of standardizing terminology within Guardian ecosystem. But also it'll enable us to then easily translate Guardian to other languages, because we would and continuously verify and optimize our development process. So that's next slide, please. That's what the sticker is about. There are a number of suggestions within that came from the community and just general feedback from users about various elements in Guardian UI. There are too many of them, and they're too minor to list all of them in here, but they are collected elsewhere. And it's, they're not, this ticket doesn't target. And you've noticed in this path, in this presentation, there are multiple tickets that kind of target the same problem, but in slightly different ways. So this particular one is just solving the immediate inconveniences. Something is not displayed in the right place. For example, you look at, I don't know, a token, and it doesn't immediately show in a particular page which standard registry issued that, and it's an information that's very relevant. So that sort of thing. So we've got a collection of this. We would address this as part of this ticket if this ticket is prioritized higher enough. But there are other tickets that talk about major advancements in Guardian UI, reworked of it and so on, and you'll see them a little later. Next slide, please. This ticket is about using the facility, a fantastic facility that Hedera provides us to generate state proofs, which would enable evaluating a particular data and proving that data is being valid even outside access to Hedera. Everything, the entire world is collapsing, but the state proof is still can be evaluated and guaranteed to prove that a particular data is valid. It's relevant for long-lived assets and projects like environmental projects that can last for decades. Next slide, please. Yes, so we've got, as we were talking about earlier, we've got cross-user workflows in a single Guardian instance. And previously we were talking about extending that across multiple Guardian instances in policy chaining situation. But this ticket talks about and targets a single Guardian instance policy workflows, but just improving the functionality. At the moment, notifications are there, but you can't, as a user, you can't configure your notifications. You can't, normally you'd be expected to go and have a UI and saying, I want to receive this via email, but these summaries for a week, and these I don't want to ever receive, I want to ignore them and so on, but you can't configure those in Guardian at the moment. So this ticket is about that. Next slide, please. Yeah, maybe not this phase, but previous phase, we've implemented tools functionality in Guardian. Tools are the elements, they are like Guardian modules, policy modules, but they are immutable. So it's an element of the policy that you include into the policy in your Guardian, almost like by reference. It's you map ins and outs, but the code execution within that, it's almost like this enclave that is immutable. And because of this, it doesn't map easily to various other UI, particular UI concepts within Guardian. They participate in searches, they participate in diffs at the moment, but they're not, perhaps these things can be improved how they're handled, because you don't really need to search multiple times within the tool, right? Because it's immutable. So all the searches, all the indexes can be optimized, for example. And there are various other aspects. So this ticket targets this better integration of tools and enhancements. Next slide, please. Key rotation workflow it's been requested, I think, multiple times, and it's to do with being able to implement security policies. Common security practice is rotating keys periodically, and we need to support that in Guardian. At the moment, it's not a trivial operation. Next slide, please. This is about enabling support for hosted services in various clouds, but this specific one is about AWS hosted database. Clearly, the industry, software industry, has been moving into the hosted paradigm for decades now, and there's more and more higher sort of top level platform as a services available there, and one of the databases are I think one of the cornerstones of this. And it would be great if Guardian could be composed of those services easily, and this is the step towards that direction. Next slide, please. Yes, so we discussed this for a while, and this is an enhancement really to our current practices with regard to depreciation of specifically API elements. We have to advance this because the scope, the size of the API has grown rapidly, and as it was designed previously, now the practice is probably becoming too complex to track and too complex for not for us to track, but for the community. So whoever is using the API would probably not want to upgrade as frequently as we envisioned originally. For that, maybe we would have a Guardian being updated but supporting multiple versions of the API. Maybe you could upgrade your APIs and your software that integrates with Guardian more. We would like to decouple basically Guardian software upgrades from Guardian API upgrades, so you don't have to upgrade your systems when you upgrade Guardian. So next slide, please. This ticket is about, the goal is to make it more convenient potentially for contributors from the community outside of the immediate sort of maintain team that maintaining Guardian, enable easier contributions specifically of the UI functionality. Many contributions came in, but a lot of them are more like back-endy things, but we would welcome contributions in the UI as well. And if we were to introduce Guardian UI components library, where you can just throw components together and create, let's say, a new page, and maybe maintain that page maybe only on your instance because you'd want maybe a particular configuration nobody else wants, or contributing it back to the original Guardian code base, this would hopefully help. Next slide, please. I guess this ticket is self-explanatory. It's slightly low level. It's also about improving the usability of the API. We've been requested multiple times to be able to use a synchronous, not asynchronous, but synchronous model of execution, because most of it is asynchronous, and it's rightly because pretty much every operation in Guardian can trigger long-lasting operations with external systems, maybe APFS upload, or maybe minting on hedera of multiple tokens potentially that it can happen. So what normally happens if you execute the code, you say get a response, and then you need to query to get the results, details about that operation. So in some cases that's undesirable for some applications, and this ticket is about introducing asynchronous mode for these operations. Next slide, please. This is another structural UI improvement. This is different from developing your own components libraries. So developing your own components libraries is like best case scenario, but it costs in terms of time and effort. An intermediate step towards that could be just standardizing on a particular library that we get out of the box rather than mixing them, because that would enable maybe someone with a certain skill set could easier operate in this. Unfortunately, and the reason why it's not like this at the moment is because not these we couldn't find a single library that satisfied all of the requirements of Guardian for Guardian capabilities that are expressed in its UI. So we had to use multiple, but we think now that it can be resolved. That's a initiative about that. Yeah, so this is kind of sister topic to the previous APIs, synchronous, asynchronous operations. It's slightly different angle to it, but again, it's to do with the usability of the APIs. Next slide, please. I'm gonna hurry up. Yeah, so we have a capability of capturing and replaying data and comparing results of policies currently already, but it is limited to the dry run mode. It's great for being able to test policies, because you can dry run a policy, capture data, and then you upgrade Guardian, and then you can, let's say, rerun that what you've captured against the same policy on the new instance of Guardian and see whether the data that's been produced is the same. That means everything is working as before, so it's great. But what for many use cases, notably the use case of having tamper-resistant imports of the policy, what you'd like to do is somebody's produced certain data, you know what the inputs were into that policy, you know what the policy you'd like to check that they didn't tamper with their Guardian instance, for example. So you can rerun the same policy with the same data as been published by the policy in IPFS and elsewhere, all your Guardian instance, and then compare it against the, and that you deterministically figure out whether the policies are equivalent by the virtue of them having the same inputs and the same outputs. Next slide, please. It's one of the use cases. There are many others. Yes, it's a structural improvement to the way Guardian policies are created. It's quite kind of low level, but we would like to standardize everything in the JSON, and at the moment, it's as you see from this ticket, it's not that. Yeah, next slide, please. Yes, ticket is about again improving an experience of the policy author. And once again, we've introduced a particular method of doing these automatic fields previously and based on the assumption that the use case is not very frequent, but it turns out the practice shows that actually it is very common. So we are hoping to optimize this by using a different approach. Next slide, please. Yes, so this is a ticket that a more generalized, I guess, version of the ticket we considered earlier about formulas and their representation in Guardian schema hierarchy. If you remember, it was ticket number 3 that we considered. But this it talks about generally enhancing schema architecture diagram. If you remember, Guardian has this facility where you could see schema dependencies and hierarchy and so on. But what would be great is having this in dynamics. So not only that just structural, but also where the schemas are used and augmenting it with various other data that helps with data comprehension. Next slide, please. Yes, in many cases, this is maybe the usability of Guardian, but improvement for project developers, for actual users of Guardian rather than policy authors. And we know that from many of those users are confused by the questions that methodologists ask. The methodology is quite complex, and many of the data fields that are required for processing of a particular project are very common across multiple projects. So policy authors could foresee the answers and provide default values for this, and they could be either mandatory, meaning these are the suggested values, but you have to choose one, or these are the suggested values, but you don't have to provide anything, or these are the suggested values, and if you don't choose a particular value, a default value would be used in place for your project. So the next slide, please. This is a community requested ticket, as you could see, and many other things. Pretty much every ticket that we discussed so far have been community requested, and that's to do with the improving integration capabilities. So an integration client of Guardian can make sensible decisions based on the fine-grained matching of the error codes that Guardian returned. At the moment, quite a few error codes are generic, 500 error code that it doesn't distinguish between different types of errors. So a further processing needs to happen and may complicates the client unnecessarily. Next slide, please. This is, in fact, I can't remember who requested it, but it's also community. It was generated by the community, even though it wasn't expressed in this. And basically, the goal is as you know, policies in Guardian can contain 2 types of kind of tokens that can be defined in different. The token can be defined by the policy as a token, or a token template can be recorded in the policy, and then the policy workflow can then define the tokens based on those templates. And at the moment, action block that is a major component that talks about associated various other operations on the token doesn't work as well with the latter, the template-based tokens, and it needs to be improved. It's a limitation of the policy definition language currently. Next slide, please. Yes, so there's another ticket that addresses an issue. There are actually quite a few tickets that are addressing the various issues with Guardian build. Early on in the evolution of Guardian, when it was just being, its functionality scope was new, it was assumed that most of the users of Guardian, external community members, would prefer to compile Guardian from source and then execute it. But it's not necessarily, and I think we are at the stage of Guardian maturity where majority would actually not want to compile it from source. They'd be happy to run Guardian from pre-built images. Also, it helps with managing dependencies. We've had quite a few problems with builds for older instances where the dependencies moved on and those maintainers introduced incompatibilities and so builds don't work. So that this would address this problem. And clearly this is a second ticket in the same area that would also target an easy upgrade of your local Guardian instance. So you don't rebuild the Docker containers that are relevant to you. And next slide, please. That's yet another ticket to do with that. If you actually do rebuild those Docker containers locally with your source, we can optimize this operation significantly. Next slide, please. Yes, so this ticket targets, it's been discussed in our community meetings several times, but to simplify the use case for it, if you have currently multiple tabs in the browser open, it's only a single tab that can maintain the connection. The other tabs are logged out. Partly partly it's a conscious decision for security, but also other purposes. And other purposes is that if you're executing a policy, it's not that easy to create multi-thread execution of the policy. Then there should be some sort of, and it's a common problem with software engineers, some mutexes, some locks on certain pieces of policy, and so to avoid complex multi-threading issues. That's what's been introduced, a single login from a single session, user session. However, it doesn't have to be that. We can, if we do some work, enable multiple the same user sessions active at the same time. Yeah, it remains to be determined how it's priority of this with regard to all other tickets. Next slide, please. Yes, so this is not a big ticket. There's been a number of times where community members have been confused with various items in this schema for standard registry. Particularly, it's relevant for new users of Guardian, which are presented with concepts that they just deployed Guardian, they just started looking at it, not familiar with it at all, and then there's some complex concepts that are confusing that are not necessary. It can be modified, but we want to change the defaults to make it as easy as possible for new users. This ticket's about that. Next slide, please. Yes, this ticket, there have been multiple discussions on this. We are still in discussion. It's to do with how you get trust chain information via the API. So we've got two ways of retrieving that. There's one that is a specific API endpoint. So we refer to it as old API endpoints for auditors, where you could a user with auditor role can request that information, or within the policy. Obviously, any user within the policy that's been configured to have access to trust chain can also retrieve that information as well. So I think currently it's flexible enough. Whether an enhancement to this model need to be made is a matter of discussions, but we've captured that in this ticket. Next slide, please. Yes, so this is once again community requested ticket, as you could see. And we've discussed just earlier that policies have two types currently of tokens and token templates. However, the issue is that those tokens, both of those concepts, have a predetermined token IDs. So anyone who is using any project that's being guided by this policy will be issuing but as a standard registry would be issuing minting tokens with those IDs for all those projects. So it's quite difficult to determine to distinguish between them and to determine which token belongs to which project. It would have been easier had these tokens had different ID, but obviously they're issued by the same standard registry. Maybe somehow they mark somewhere that they're issued by the same policy. At the moment, you could clearly see it's the same policy, but which project is secondary. You need to do like evaluation of the metadata. I think the request is to swap these things. The priority is which project this token was issued under, and then which policy for secondary information. So that's this ticket records this task. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is a new initiative, so it's not been, we're still in discussion of what needs to happen there, but the idea is that it should be possible for project developers to see prognosis or somehow forecast, but based on the current policy, what this project will produce as a result, and therefore you could see, calculate maybe ROI and so on. We have this dry run for policy authors now, which focuses on the policy, but some way of dry running of a project against the published policy, ideally with a convenient UI, maybe without having to submit the data in the policy forms, but provide it maybe in a spreadsheet or something like that, a more convenient interface, an interface targeting project developers would be great. It's really needed. How exactly it can be implemented is a matter of discussions, but yeah, this goal is recorded in this ticket. And please contribute to this discussion in GitHub or in Slack. Next slide, please. Yeah. So we've got many elements that compose this ticket currently, but what that doesn't happen is it's not a very easy task to compare tokens from a business perspective. You could compare the technical maybe details about the token. You could see all the VCs that have been done on this, and you can even compare VCs between themselves, but it's just too much low-level information. And we are talking about creating a more business-oriented tools of comparing tokens and then grading them in some way, and that way some sort of rating agency or an authority, somebody reviewing this and targeting, and then others not having to do that because they trust an opinion of a particular organization and so on. So implementing this would enable creation of new, maybe almost like sub-industry within the industry, but of being able to provide additional services, information to the users. Next slide, please. Yes, so we've got another ticket targeting retirement operations, and those retirement operations, that ticket targets additional kind of rules of retirements, but we're talking about a specific token, and it's guided by the policy of a standard registry that issues this. Here, the goal is different. It's a more higher level concept. It's geared towards enabling like third parties creating various services around this retirement operation, and that's why it's like decentralized exchange. Clearly, the concept of decentralized exchange doesn't directly map into this. It's not exchanging of tokens for tokens, but it's more to do with retirement of burning, wiping tokens. But the concept is similar. It's a contract or a set of contracts deployed externally that relies on the retirement operations various rules that exist already in other contracts that are developed by the standard registries, but also implements various other concepts and rules. I don't know, pooling, more like not financial, but similar to financial rules, I guess. Exchange rates, dynamic exchange rates, and so on, because at the moment the exchange rates are not dynamic, and there's no way to define a range, for example, for retirement operations as a standard registry, but these things can do that. So that's what's about enabling that industry to create, to exist. Yeah, and supporting, for example, this function as well. And this function is there've been many discussions about this, and this is to do with the ability to recover from erroneous various things. So we've got functionality currently in Guardian where you can retract some issued documentation. You revoke it and anything that depends on that also gets automatically revoked. But we haven't yet resolved the issue of what to do with tokens when a token's been minted on the basis of that chain of documentation that's been revoked now. So there's no way to that the issuance of the token is not justified, but it could have been resolved, transferred, and so on, and how to deal with that. So this ticket targeting situations like this. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is, I mentioned earlier when we were considering a ticket of UI enhancements, that the ticket there was focusing on minor UI enhancements, immediate inconveniences. This is a major rework of Guardian UI. At the moment, there been expressed some opinions that it's too low level, too technically focused UI, and you need to understand many of the concepts from a Guardian ecosystem that to be able to use Guardian, and it's probably not feasible to educate. Hopefully, the industry will grow massively, and it'll be a challenge to educate everyone about these concepts because people tend to specialize in their areas and they shouldn't really know how it works. All they need to know is what they need to do, and targeting a non-technical, non-blockchain enabled user is within this initiative would be the goal. Next slide, please. Yes, so we have elements of this currently, which is a retirement, but there are many other operations that can happen on a token once it's been minted. So everything before token's been minted is currently definable. It's the entire life cycle, all the rules on various things, that artifacts that have been produced by in the course of execution of Guardian policy are managed by that Guardian policy. However, once the token's been minted, at the moment, the only thing that is influenced by a Guardian policy, it's retirement rule. And even then, it's not really a policy. It's more like an action of a standard registry. But what it shouldn't be the case. Within the policy, you should be able to also define that these tokens are behaving like this and only can be transferred that way and so on. And these policy rules then need to be implemented in some sort of a smart contract that would control the operations on the token. And different standard registries may have different rules. I don't know, geographic, for example, restrictions or various other things that can be required for assets that's been issued within a particular jurisdiction, let's say. Yes, that's another enhancement that we talked about previously, standardizing terminology and improving like how Guardian policy handles, in this particular case, status options. Next slide, please, Prina. Yeah, so we have implemented Fireblocks, as you know previously. There are some limitations on what keys and what operations are currently executed through Fireblocks due to the API restrictions and really the stability of the operation. The next stage would be to expand the level these operations to other areas. Many I think, I guess Guardian executes produces many signatures in the course of executing a policy. It's almost every second that something happens. Some of them, it would be best to automate all of them and offload this to Fireblocks for remote signing. Currently, it's not the case. So that's what this ticket's about. So this ticket is an alternative to the ticket we just discussed. Obviously, there we discussed for Fireblocks, and so that it automatically signs the operation, but in place remotely. This is introducing a capability for users to use self-custodial wallets and kind of being prompted for signatures explicitly and so on. That way, it's more aligned with maybe not your keys, not your coin concept within the blockchain industry. So it's an alternative way of approaching for some sensitive messages. Yes. So we have a trust chain, which visualization as well as a corresponding API with the various informations about the trust chain. It's quite powerful. At the moment, it doesn't represent evolution of the policy as well as it could. So remember, we've got this data migration capability within Guardian, so mostly used for you are on the version 1 of a particular policy. You want to migrate your project onto version 1.1 of that policy seamlessly. You could do that now and continue execution and so on. And that transition is recorded in the trust chain, but it's not, it's not as explanatory as well as you might want to see other things, because the versions you can migrate policy projects onto different Guardian instances and so on, and you'd want to be able to see this in a convenient format in the trust chain. So this ticket targets this task. Next slide, please. Yes, there have been a number of requests and from the community to enhance the roles and various rules associated with roles for complex use cases, and they're not maybe some of the use cases we couldn't envision when originally implemented that. And yes, the two particular one recorded on the right hand side here, but please contribute other use cases to because there's always a trade-off between the complexity and usability, and we need to know where the right line is. So we would like to have the list of use cases so we can verify that our suggested implementation covers all of that. So still a bit of work required on defining that ticket. Yes, so we have implemented in actually just this release what we call mass diff. It's basically global search and diff on policies. So it answers the simple question of find me another policy, published policy that is very similar to my policy, and it'll give you the top policies that are ranked and in the order of compatibility with the policy they're looking at, and you can diff them and see what the differences are and so on. This ticket is the evolution of this functionality. So, but when the ticket is implemented, you'd be able not to search not for policies, but search for elements within the policy. You can select 5 blocks like this. Let's say, find me globally a policy that has a chain of blocks as similar as possible. Basically, you rank them by similarity that they contain the chain of blocks most similar, and it'll give you that. At the moment, that's not possible globally. Next slide, please. Okay. Yeah, the oracles. If you remember, there was an earlier ticket about DEX, smart contracts that implements operations to do with token matching and retirement, so on. And so I was talking about various complicated rules for retirements, and one of them could be various questions that that contract may want to ask. And the issue that we have is much of that information is verifiable and immutable and trustworthy, but it's not available for smart contracts because it's off-chain. To implement a link between on-chain smart contracts and off-chain data, obviously it needs to be extendable, some sort of Oracle framework where various questions, the most simple question, of course, is evaluating whether the trust chain is valid and and the various properties of this, but there are many questions that also can be asked of Oracle, and on the basis this smart contract can make decisions about retirement and whatnot. So this ticket targets this functionality, and I think it's the last slide, Prina. So thank you for this long conversation, and over back to you, Prina. And I'm sorry I didn't fit into the timeline allocated.
No, thank you, Andre. Thank you so much for going over each of the worker item in detail. So any questions? Sorry for extending it for 17 minutes, but as you see that we have 55 worker items and we wanted to close all of that so that you have an idea of what we are planning, and then you can help us out in prioritizing it, and also giving us a feedback if you expect any further enhancement on any of the worker items. Please let us know. All right, so it's not ending here, guys. We already have one more sheet, Excel sheet, which we have created, and we would like to get your priorities. I would like to share that in our chat over here. So we have an Excel sheet which was created, which we have listed out all the worker items which we discussed. So please take some time and add your priorities. Please add your company name at the header so that we will get to know which company have prioritized it. And please add your vote in each of the worker items. If you have any more feedback, we have also added that specific column. So we would request all of you guys to take some time and do it. This Excel sheet would be open by next Tuesday, having July 4th week. We would just like to open this by till next week, Tuesday, so that you have an ample of time to go over the worker item. We have also added a ticket links to each of the items so that you can have a look and get more info. And please, we would request so that we can finalize our next roadmap for Guardian for the next 6 months so that all of the priority worker items are covered in that roadmap. That's about it. Thank you, guys. Thank you for joining and have a great day. And please looking forward to your priorities and feedback. Thank you.